When I was a first year resident, I knew I wanted to do a fellowship. I just didn't know what I needed to do to prepare for that. I also had to decide which fellowship I wanted to do and where. I eventually ended up getting two fellowships, and I'm currently doing my first one. My name is Abdul Abid, and I'm the Surgical Pathology Fellow at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. I am here to guide you through the fellowship and interview process and what questions you should ask yourself before applying for fellowships. This talk is intended for junior residents and medical students. Like all great stories, mine began in Florida. It was September 2019. I was there for the CAP annual meeting and I met one of my new friends, as you can see here. I was competing in an election for the Residents Forum Executive Committee, or RFEC. Before my election speech, I talked to every single person in the room, introduced myself, and asked them to vote for me, including the two people who were running against me. The next day, just before going to the exhibit hall, I ran into Dr. Ann Mills. She was an attending at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville, and we talked for a while before the exhibit hall opened. We'll come back to this story later. First, I have a few questions for you. I want to start off with some questions that you need to ask yourself, followed by a list of tasks that I want you to know, then my own experience, and finally some interview tips. First of all, this is the question that you need to ask yourself. There are many reasons why people do fellowships. One major reason is to gain more experience in a particular field so that you get confidence signing out those cases. Another reason is to improve your job prospects. Some people have other, more personal reasons for which they choose to do fellowships. You have to have an answer for this question for yourself. There is also a factor that you should think of when thinking of this question. Do you want to go into private practice or academia? This will also determine some of your decisions. So, what is a fellowship? A fellowship is a 1 year or 2 year long dedicated training in a particular subspecialty. For example, you can do a fellowship in GI pathology or clinical chemistry or forensics. There are exceptions to that in cases of more general fellowships, like general surgical pathology, in which case you look at different organ systems throughout the year. Some fellowships provide sign out experience after training for a few months. Those are called clinical instructorships, and you need to be a permanent resident or a US citizen for those. This is the second question that you have to ask yourself. How many is too many? I don't have a perfect answer for that. Generally, people do at least one. If you want to go into academia, you usually do a specialized fellowship, such as a breast or GYN or hempath. And if you want to go into private practice, you usually do more general fellowships, like general surgical pathology and cytopathology. But it is not written in stone. Some people do specialized fellowships and they end up in private practice. Some are more marketable than others, such as hempath or cytopath. You can take them both ways, it doesn't really matter. This is a third question that you should ask yourself. Do you want to stay at your residency program or do you want to go elsewhere? Does your home institution offer the fellowship that you want, or do you have to look elsewhere? It may sound a cliche, but my advice is follow what you love. So don't follow trends that, oh, this person or that person is doing such and such fellowship, so I should be doing that. You should do the fellowship in a particular area that you are interested in because there is a very high likelihood that that particular field is what you will end up doing for the rest of your life. So, yeah, be careful. To be perfectly honest, it is quite easy to get your desired fellowship. It may not be exactly at the institution you want it to be all the time, but if you are a pathology resident at an ACGME accredited program in the US, your chances of getting a fellowship are very high. Do you have to be super active in national societies and meetings to get a fellowship? No. I know people who have never been to a meeting, but they have landed a decent fellowship. However, the aim of this presentation is to give you tips to distinguish yourself. I want to give you some resources and tasks when you think about applying for fellowships. Once you're done with your step three, and my advice is to get it done as soon as possible in your residency, you should apply to get FCVS. FCVS is a centralized database for your important educational documents that are stored by FSMB. And when you apply for a full unrestricted license, you don't have to collect those important documents every time. Next, you should keep copies of all of your important documents in an accessible folder. It could be on your computer or it could be on the cloud somewhere, but it should be accessible. Uh, you should check out websites of programs that you want to apply for fellowships because different programs have different requirements. When you're asking for letters of recommendations, ask faculty whom you have worked with and who you think would write you a good LOR. And when you decide who you want to write your LOR, talk to them at least a month in advance before the LOR is due. Lastly, look at the CAP Fellowship Roadmap, and I'll show you where to find it. Let's take a look at the timeline of the fellowship process. Typically, you apply at the end of your second year of residency in late June, early July, with some exceptions. That is why keeping up with program websites is important. Some specialties are now doing what is called a unified timeline, in which all programs interview during a set time period and then they offer on one pre-decided day. That way, if you interviewed at 5 places and 3 programs want to offer you, you get all those offers on the same day. Next up, let's see some of the resources that I mentioned. So this is a screenshot of where you can get FCVS on the FSMB website on the lower left corner. The next few slides are based on my personal experience while applying for fellowships. This is a screenshot of my folder for fellowships with my important documents collected all at one place so that I don't have to go looking when I'm applying for a certain place. This is the webpage of one of the programs that I was applying to. As you can see, they mention which documents they require with the application. So this is why it is important to, to keep looking at the program websites. This is an Excel file that my work, the program where I was at, they provided to ask for LORs for multiple programs so that you don't have to send them information every time you need an LOR. So for example, if you're applying at 10 places, you don't have to send 10 emails. You could just have one centralized database. And this is an example of how I filled it up. You can follow it if you want. There's no particular, this is not a set in stone requirement necessarily. And I want to share with you a very useful resource for compiling your CV and personal statements. You have to be a member of the CAP to access this. So firstly, go to the CAP website, click on member resources, then go to residence and then residence forum. At the bottom of the page, there is a link that says login to access. So click on that. Once you get there, go to the Spring 2021 meeting page and watch the RF morning session. It is barely an hour long, but it is very high yield. This is a screenshot of the CAP standardized application. Many programs don't have their own application and they ask you to fill up the CAP standardized application. So I recommend that you look it up on their website, on the CAP website, and fill it out in advance, just so that you know what are things that you require. Also on the CAP resident page, you'll see the fellowship roadmap. There is a lot of good information there, and I am personally invested in this program because I was involved in getting this through. So some additional steps that you should do before you're applying for fellowships is, if you know where you want to go, try talking to the current or recent fellows at places where you're interested. That'll give you a better feel for the place. And then I would also recommend, like unlike residency where you apply generally, for fellowships you should be applying only at places that you really want to go. Now some interview tips. So before the interview, what should you expect? Ideally, the program will send you an itinerary and you can do some research on people who will be interviewing you. This would give you talking points for the interview day. So you can look them up and do your research about those people. These are some frequently asked questions, and ideally, you should have answers ready for them before the big day. This is usually the first thing that people ask. They want to know you in your own words. This is important because the interviewer wants to know what parts of your life you emphasize and what you don't. And the recommendation is to keep it to a maximum of 2 minutes, and it should include both personal and professional information, and end it on why you are there. So, for example, if you are applying for a cytopathology fellowship, so where you were born and raised, and where you went to medical school, where you did residency, and then the last thing that you should say would be that, and I want to pursue a cytopathology fellowship. And this is another question that a lot of people are going to ask you. This is where my earlier advice about doing what you love comes in play. If you don't like a subspecialty, it is really hard to answer this question. So that's why you should pursue fellowships only in things that you really like. And if you do love what you want to do, then you definitely know can explain it to the interviewer and have some anecdotes ready as to a particular case, a patient, anything that can enhance your basically affinity for that particular subspecialty. Why here? So, for example, why at X, Y, or Z place? Why in Boston? Why New York? Like, you need to have you need to be specific in the answer. Like, that's why talking to the current or previous fellows that would be helpful. They could tell you what is special about that particular place, so you can be more specific in your answer. And this is very important because remember that an interview is not just them getting to know you, it is also you getting to know them. So you should always have some questions up your sleeve. These are some of the questions that you can ask the faculty. At many places, you also get to meet the current fellows as part of the interview process. You can ask them slightly more informal questions, and these are some things that you should definitely ask. And obviously, there are some things that you should just not ask. They are going to be part of your contract, and you usually programs send you the contract before the interview. So these are just some things that you should try to avoid. Most interviews now are via Zoom, so you should prepare for virtual interviews. Here are a few tips on how to do it effectively. So after the interview, my recommendation is to make a pros and cons list. Making this list would help you decide if there is a close call when you're deciding. If, for example, you like two programs equally, at the end when you have to decide and you get offer from two programs and you want to decide where do you want to end up, it's a big call. So at that moment, this list of pros and cons is going to help you. So that is very important. The offer time depends on if your chosen subspecialty is taking part in a unified timeline or not, and it could be some places, some programs, if they're not taking part in a unified timeline, they can offer you on the spot, and some programs can take a couple of days if they're not part of the unified timeline, and if they are, then you're gonna get multiple offers in a single day. Going back to the story that I started with, remember the slide that I showed you earlier? When it came time to apply for my first fellowship in surgical pathology, I wanted to go to UPMC. So I contacted this person who was at UPMC, and she guided me through the process. And as a result, I'm here these days as a surgical pathology fellow. For my second fellowship, I'll be going to the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. And during the interview process, Dr. Ann Mills, who I mentioned earlier, was very helpful. The bottom line of this presentation is that pathology is a small world, and the more connections that you make, the easier it is for you to advance in your career. With that, I conclude my presentation, and I wish you the best of luck on finding excellent fellowships of your choice.